So as we continue, I would like to introduce you to the panel. And I'm going to start with Whitney Konita Boysen, also known as Sindiswa Spielman, also known as Lerato Kumalo. She's a trans-identifying person from Lutzville, a rural town in South Africa. She's been involved in the LGBTIQ movement since 2011 when she started working for Gender Dynamics. She's no longer working for Gender Dynamics, but instead has started up her own organization called Trans Wellness Project that caters specifically towards visibilizing and responding to the needs of rural-based trans and gender diverse persons in the country. Whitney finished her studies in life and business coaching and is now busy obtaining a diploma in social studies and counseling. Whitney's motto in life is, everything starts with the possibility to dream. So welcome, Whitney, and thank you for joining us. Next, we have Beyonce Naris, and she is also known as Mom D, based on her role as mother to what she calls the little queers of the world in Namibia. Beyonce is a feminist, human rights and gender activist who specializes in human rights and transgender diverse persons and deconstructing gender conversation. She currently serves as the executive director of the Transgender, Intersex and Androgynous Movement of Namibia, also known as TIAMON. And TIAMON advocates for trans and gender diverse persons as well as intersex and androgynous persons within the Namibian context for rights realizations. At the moment, TIAMON holds the chair for the Southern Africa Trans Forum, and she represents the organization in that capacity. And then lastly, we have Sam Ndlovu, who is the Executive Director of Trans Research Education, Advocacy and Training, in short called TREAT, based in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. This is also a trans-led and trans-specific human rights organization. TREAT at this time holds the Vice Chair for the Southern Africa Trans Forum, and Sam represents the organization in this capacity. He also holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Communication Sciences and has been extensively involved within research. One project in particular standing out for him is AIDS funds and this focus on the rights of sex workers. This spare time, Sam is also a poet. So welcome to all three of you joining us today as we're having this conversation. I see that Beyonce has not joined us as yet. We will proceed with the session, and should she join us, we will just direct any questions or clarification towards her when she does. So just to start us off, colleagues, when we look at what COVID-19 has presented to us this year, we note that there has been a myriad of challenges that we have experienced as a collective across Southern Africa. As a starting question or opening question, I would like for you to reflect with us on the challenges that COVID-19 has brought about within your specific context. And here we're speaking about the in-country context, how it has perhaps turned your world upside down, and of course, reshaped thinking about what is important and what needs to be addressed in this moment and of course, also beyond. So for now, Sam, would you be able to start us off and then we can go over to Whitney to perhaps follow suit.
Okay, hello everyone. So this period has definitely been quite challenging for us on many levels, from the personal to the professional and in all respects. So from our context in particular, looking at Zimbabwe, a country that is currently under a lot of economic, there's a whole lot of economic pressures faced due to the current state of the economy, with inflation having gone over anything that we can manage or imagine. So the standards of living for persons, those who are disproportionately affected in society, has been quite a situation, let alone when then hit the streets. Basically, for us, the very first thing that became of concern was the issue of the medical. The medical system was was not prepared at all for a crisis, let alone our everyday services that people need to cater for their health needs. So the crisis came at a time the pay and the salaries that are received by members of the medical service, it's in terms of what they receive survive. Hence, a lot of strikes were happening at that point in time when COVID hit, and also there was no equipment or PPE to then be able to care those who were on the front line. It so happened that the situation was so bad that even in some cities, residents themselves decided to find a way in order to fundraise just to have one ventilator in Victoria Falls to cater for that particular community. In terms of diverse population, the mobility was one of the biggest concerns that we had to face in a very militarized environment. The soldiers and police were all over the streets in full force. Although generally, this also was linked to some very political issues. Hence, it was taken as an opportunity by the leaders of the nation to then curtail any sort of demonstrations or outcry in relation to how they needed to serve the people. So this really exacerbated the situation. And for trans and gender diverse persons, the fact that a highly military environment means a greater need to then identify oneself of concern, because for a lot of people, their documents are not congruent with their appearance. And this really posed quite a big risk and a threat, because even the way in which the military forces themselves engage in crowd control or in control of general persons, they are not trained to handle the public in everyday situations. It's a great challenge, be it to access services, to try and access even the hormones that people generally are taking through self-medication, heavily on black market hormones and materials. So beyond even the general healthcare or HIV-related materials, which often quite readily available, because this is what we have gotten en masse of interventions that deal with our communities. The issue of people being at home and stuck with their perpetrators, be it families did not accept as who they were, now having to constantly for some having lived a double life, having to constantly face these family members every single day, and really trying to engage or negotiate personal space within a very transphobic home environment, and people with their families because they cannot self. So this period was really damaging in relation to mental health. It was quite difficult space to be able to take care of oneself and one's psyche. Intimate partner violence as well. In some cases, intimate partners living with them because that seemed the safer option to be stuck with families that are affirming of oneself. So the power relations of the resources within that relationship. So then the disparity in that, leaving people really vulnerable to situations, partner in that. generally, even in terms of income, some people rely is so during this period, unfortunate incident of went missing. Went missing twice. There were stories and that were being passed around that a body had been found, which was then unlikely. There was a likelihood that this was the body, this was her body, though still to this day ascertaining that has been to no avail, because with families that are not, it was quite a challenge of the trans and gender diverse community in terms of seeking justice or recourse was very much, because the first port of call in terms of how a person then is able to seek justice or how we're able to follow through with the case, they become gatekeepers to that kind of a situation. So for us, to this day, we still do not have answers in relation to that incident. And it's quite scary because this happened this disappearance post an altercation with some soldiers in her neighborhood. So it's really been quite challenging in terms of the work environment itself. The fact that we're considered essential service workers, mobility even for organizations to get to their beneficiaries has been quite difficult. So it really has been time for many organizations.
Thank you very much for those reflections, Sam. Whitney, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liberty, and hi to everyone. Thank you for joining us on this very important discussion. I think I want to start off by saying that COVID-19 or total lockdown was in effect was not something very new to trans people, because for so long, all our lives, we have to mask ourselves up for people's way how they see us, people's way how they treat us. And I think we already our whole life were wearing masks against the greater population out there. So the situation in South Africa is almost similar to the situation that we just hear that was happening in Zimbabwe. I think, or Zimbabwe, yes. I think when our president announced in March this year that the whole of South Africa needs to go in total lockdown, it hits the whole community hard, but it hits trans and gender diverse people the hardest, in the way that immediately people was only people that give essential services could continue with the work that they do. And if you look in our country and maybe abroad as well, and what is listed as essential service, most of our trans and LGBTIQA plus people are excluded from those services, because most of us are hairdressers, most of us are doing sex work, most of us are in services that are not listed as essential. And what that means actually is that for a period, our people lost an income, they lost a job. And what that means for trans and gender diverse people is they need to stay in homes. And what happens is, especially in the areas that we are working with, is our people were locked in a house or in in a building where they were locked with the abuser, because most of us experience that you need to stay with your families. If you don't want to stay in the street, you stay with your families, but your family are actually, or there's a family member that actually are your primary abuser in the house, in the sense that they physically abuse you, they psychologically abuse you, they financially abuse you, they mentally abuse you, and they rape you. Trans and gender diverse people, it was very hard. So one of the things that we noticed as Trans Wellness Project was, because people did not contribute anymore to the household financially, was they either needed to look out for another place to stay, or they need to do something in return to contribute to the household. And what happened was, in Cape Town specifically, the government set up a shelter in a place called Strandfontein. Well, for me personally, I was not there. I was not part of it, but I could read in what comes out of this of that shelter, and it was brutally for trans and gender diverse people to stay in those shelters. I mean, the circumstances that people stayed in, for instance, was not a well circumstances. People were getting raped there. People did not have access to their like for people that are HIV positive, could not have access to their medication. So for trans and gender diverse people, LGBTIQA plus people in South Africa, it was really a hard time. So when we talk also about medical care and access to medical care, is we need to understand that trans people and gender diverse people are not only seeking medical care for gender or gender affirming, but they're seeking medical care for in general. So what happens now is we do have people that are HIV positive, so they could not access medical services at that time. People that are on hormones, in order to affirm their gender, also they could not have access to their hormones, and it means that especially the people live with HIV, it means they default on their medication, but not only on the medication, and the medication was a very important part of the people's life, but also how they default is because of how food securities played a role in that instance. We noticed, or we experienced, that government were handed out food parcels in our country, but with the situation where trans and gender diverse people do not have identity documents that match their gender identity, so they were excluded from the services that government gave, because they could not apply for the food parcel or for the money that government put out there for people that lost their jobs due to COVID-19, because of the discrimination that is in our government systems or our government departments, because they will see a one face or a one name in the ID book, and the person in front of them are identifying totally different. So immediately there is questions, immediately there's discrimination, and immediately trans and gender diverse people are excluded from those services. And then we have our police systems, or our police that brutally handled trans and gender diverse people in a way that if they found our trans sisters on the street, they're trying to do some work, they're trying to do some sex work, people were put in jails, they were manhandled, they were assaulted by the police themselves, in so much so that I think, and Liberty can correct me, that one of our trans people were in holding cells, and that person gets sick and initially died of I'm not sure if she died in the cells or did she died in the hospital. But the way she was treated by the police was very, very, very brutal. So yes, yeah, but and also we have what we as Trans Wellness Project try to do in this instance. If I can go continue, Liberty.
Whitney, can I ask that we pause for now because there are a couple of aspects
Okay.
we want to explore. Thank you for a very well-rounded perspective that you've shared with us, and definitely echoing the issues around police brutality under what we dubbed as a police state, and a nanny state that then turned into a police state enforcing lockdown measures in South Africa. And of course, how that also has kind of similarities with what happened within the Zimbabwean context, which is then militarized state in order to enforce lockdown measures as well. With that being said, I think one key issue that also stands out is very much that during lockdown, and this is something that one of my colleagues coined at another event that I went to today. Home is where the hate is for us as trans and gender diverse persons. And in a sense, when we look at how we constantly negotiate our way through family, with community, having access to a job, whether in the informal or formal market, gives us an opportunity to use income as a bargaining chip for our inclusion within those spaces. And so when we lose our jobs, when we lose our livelihoods, it in turn sets in place a different trajectory of events, which is then we are no longer seen as an asset, but a liability. And of course, the violence follows that. So a lot of work that we still need to do at a community and at a family level. Sam, perhaps just want to shift over to you in your capacity as the vice chair of the Southern Africa Trans Forum. You've also had an opportunity to have somewhat of a bird's eye view around what's happening across Southern Africa in the context of one of the initiatives undertaken at the beginning of lockdown in March, was the creation of an online conversations platform between Gender Dynamics, SATF, and Iranti, amplifying the voices of trans and gender diverse persons in Southern Africa. Subsequent to that, we also then invested into conducting a capacity assessment and a needs assessment. Would you be able to speak to some of the more broader issues facing Southern Africa as a region?
Okay, so that initiative was quite interesting, and I think quite well timed in terms of being able to assess the landscape throughout the region, because there were so many similarities that were pertaining in the various contexts and in the various countries. The issue of how governments were then particularly advantage of the situation in order to perhaps strengthen and other. They had looking at political situation across from Botswana, from generally all the Zimbabwe situation that occurred. And in terms of the solidarity from within the region, that was not a real. It wasn't really shown in terms of then had was sort of a comfort and a grace for many of us, because in terms of regional solidarity, it always gives us strength to understand that there is a sense of caring for what happens in contexts other than those that are. So this platform also highlighted many issues with regards to migrants, as there are a lot of migrants in the various contexts. So to access even the most basic needs within this period. as citizens of that nation, how they are then affected in basic of needs that they have.
I think we might have lost Sam, everyone. Just perhaps to, okay, I think Sam has rejoined the session. Sam, are you there? So I think perhaps just to complement some of the aspects that Sam touched on, during the course of the 3 processes that we outlined, it became increasingly clear, as both colleagues have indicated, that trans and gender diverse persons have been placed on the back burner and of course marginalized from state resources that had to be distributed, but also the status of service rendering, looking at through the lens that a lot of service providers in and of themselves were not necessarily sensitized towards the needs of trans and gender diverse persons. In some contexts, we find that the criminalization of LGBTI persons through conduct, of course, that still persists throughout the region has implication for how trans and gender diverse persons are subjected to these laws based on how we are visible on a day-to-day basis. And of course, that in itself elicits violence. One particular incident that occurred within the Namibian context was, again, where a community leader had subjected a trans woman to a brutal assault for claiming her identity within that particular context. And of course, that particular scenario really highlighted how ineffective our own processes and systems are, to the extent of not being able to get persons to points of access and care, and of course being able to have human rights violations addressed, which then became a focal point for what we needed to address through our COVID-19 response action subsequently. Sam, I was just touching, speaking to some of the matters that came up within the regional conversations that we've had and the capacity assessment. Please feel free to continue where you left off.
Okay, this is quite reminiscent of some of the situations we had during the digital conversations and just the upscale of the digital working during the COVID period. So basically, during this time, it was also when we assessed that various spaces for, be it mental health support, be it support in relation to just a sense of belonging for many trans and gender diverse persons across the region. During this time, you could really tell that the issue of the digital divide was of big concern, because these spaces were only being availed to those who could have access to some sort of gadget or who could access data. And even for some with the gadgets, accessing data was quite a big concern, with, in some cases, data tariffs going up even in during the time of crisis. There were issues around national responses that were not catering for trans and gender diverse persons, be it in relation to the issue of the ID or just general perceptions that are held by those who are providing the services in terms of the national responses in the cases where national responses existed, whereas in some countries they did not even have adequate national responses to cater for the general citizen, let alone those on the margins. So in terms of the response that then was carried through by Gender Dynamics and the SATF, I think it really helped to have this plan, the very basic of needs that persons had within, because it was a lot of, at that time, funding that people were holding within their institutions did not cater for or speak to the very most basic of needs. And this includes institutions themselves who found themselves at a point where administrators, they were unable to to be able to cater for just keeping the institution going during that particular time, because normally this is always attached to funding that relate to activities that during this particular time. So with that, response, the very concern, especially around data and availing spaces, availing data support for at least our community within the region to be able to reach out to each other in cases of be it emergencies, or to be able to articulate their needs to someone that would be able to at least assist in some way, or just generally to have that continued solidarity in movement building going on as far as we could during that time of crisis. And some issues to note would relate to the mental health support that a few of our individuals were able to access across the region, which was very important and crucial. And I would like to specifically speak to the issue of leaders within the region during that time, having to at the same time try and deal with trying to access services or avail services or help during this particular crisis as beneficiaries, but at the same time also in terms of support and individuals keep it together and just not totally lose it, just literally being on the edge while trying to help the community avert being and various issues that were coming up. So this was really also looking at how that support is in order to be to enable leaders to be able to carry out their mandate to crisis or post-crisis. So generally in the region, what I felt though, it really gave us a sense of what issues we would particularly need to look at strategically, especially in the uniform actions and reactions of our governments within the region, and how we really needed to start thinking about what our response would be as a region, as regional movements in relation to some of the patterns that were pertaining during this situation. So it really was a great time for that reflection. And in as much it really put us between a rock and a hard place, it also gave us that opportunity to start thinking more about how our unity of purpose was quite essential for us then to be able to survive and grow even beyond this particular crisis.
Thank you very much for those insights shared, Sam. I think one thing that also became very clear to us early on was the emphasis on service delivery. And then, of course, at an organizational level, we know that many trans-led and trans-specific organizations are predominantly pivoted towards advocacy work. And so to a greater extent, that also meant that we had to shift capacity towards service delivery. And that, of course, attracted a lot of attention and focus that we ought to have placed on advocacy away from those particular objectives. One example of this is in the South African context, where we've seen that Home Affairs suspended service delivery for legal gender marker changes, and how that impacted trans persons as lockdown continued to extend, as the suspension continued to be in operation in the department, because more people were moving around without appropriate identification documents that captures the actual identity on a day-to-day basis, and of course opening up that up to violence. So that was very much also a key insight to this particular process. Issue of power relations within the movement and of course outside of the movement also became somewhat of an issue as we're looking at resourcing. Who's able to attract resources, who is able to initiate conversation and move with community. And I think those are a couple of issues that we do need to unpack as a trans movement across the region in order to engage external stakeholders like funders, like other bigger organizations supporting this work in having a conversation over time. How do we even dismantle unequal power relations within the movement in which we exist? And then, of course, the last one was really around a highlight that the issues that we have been experiencing before COVID-19, that has been amplified during COVID-19, stems well beyond the HIV AIDS discourse of interventions, in that if people need to have social security nets to be able to fall back, or socioeconomic security nets to be able to fall back onto, and that our issues cannot just be addressed through HIV/AIDS responses. And I think that is a different conversation that we ought to have with funders around what does transformation look like within the year to come outside of that particular model. With that being said, I'm just looking at the time. It's about quarter to the hour. And perhaps just to bring it back, Sam, you've spoken about some of the interventions that we have then launched during the past couple of months. That's going to be ongoing up until the end of June of next year, in supporting about 23 organizations across 10 Southern Africa countries. In looking, one of the questions that have come up in the chat box has been the issue around best practices and learnings. Both yourself, Whitney, and Sam, can you reflect on some of the learnings that you have been able to encounter during this time and how that is to be taken forward, but also reflect on some of the best practices that you think could serve the movement and organizations well beyond? Whitney, please do go first, and then you go.
Okay, I think for me personally, but also for me as the director of Trans Wellness Project, it was not, I won't say it was an eye opener, but it just it reflects on the fact that when you identify other way as the sex characteristics that was assigned on your at birth to you, that you are really left out in community programmings. If I can make an example, it was during lockdown, and still it happens. It's something that comes along, but I mean during lockdown specifically, political parties was looking out for their members, because political parties handed out food parcels to the INC, handed out to the ANC members. The EFF handed out to the EFF members. The DA handed out to the DA members. Churches, just in my small town, there is about 8 to 13 churches in my small town of about less than 12,000 people, but they handed out people only to their food parcels, only to their people, to their church members. Sports clubs, for instance, come to think about it, sports clubs handed out food parcels only to their sports club members. And what happens is out of Trans Wellness Project, we needed to strategically partner with organizations in this region. And the organizations, I want to highlight a few organizations that we are really grateful that they help us through these times. And why I highlighted organizations is because if we talk about best practices and eye-opening, we could see now in these times who our partners and who can we continue in the long run and form more stronger partnerships with. So one of the partners that we have was
Apologies, Whitney. Can I perhaps just interject it, because I'm looking at time. We will come back to closing remarks, and then you can perhaps touch on that again. Apologies for that. Sam, just a short reflection from your end.
Okay, for me, I think basically the consultative approach to the interventions that are needed by by various communities. It's very important that we consult, because a lot of the interventions that came up were just thrust at people without really looking at the issue around upscaling of Whitney had alluded to earlier on about food security to then being able to. So consultative approaches are of paramount importance. Looking at inequality in itself, issues like digital divide, what can we do right now to bridge the inequalities that were further heightened or further seen during this COVID time? Saw exactly where the gaps lie in the communities that were most affected, so that in the event such situations ever happen, we are able then to ensure that they are not left out, or their voice left out, and they are not left behind. And then just basically looking at regional interventions, the issue of strategically speaking to how we then hold our to account collectively within the region, because such bodies do exist, like the SADC. And it would be important for us then of calling and letting them know that whatever it is that they are copying from each other does not continually continue to pertain, but just also the sense of unity within movements, and ensuring that you think of the wider. We need to seriously consider thinking of the wider collective, and not only looking at our interventions from a one-sided kind of reality perspective.
Very much, colleagues, for those insights. I'm going to open it up to the floor for any reflections or questions that you might want to pose to the two panelists. I've seen two questions being raised by Ellen and by Sarah. Do you perhaps just want to speak to those particular reflections and questions that you have? Ellen, can we perhaps go with you first? Take yourself off mute. Should we be able to take Ellen off mute to ask the question? So Ellen, whilst we are waiting for that to be sorted, would you be able to speak to the point that you raised in the chat box? Colleagues are having a little bit of difficulty speaking. So some of the reflections definitely came up around the issue of pride and the role that pride can play in supporting some of the national and local initiatives to drive change. And one of that is looking at the support for legislative changes in relation to trans campaigns that ought to be led. I think predominantly we touched on the issue that Sarah raised earlier on. So I'm looking at time now. Jessica is saying that Ellen, okay, just by providing some technical support there. So colleagues, I think in terms of looking at time now, we're standing 5 minutes to the hour. Just some closing remarks from your end in terms of what does 2021 look like? Know that the challenges still continues. However, there might be some solutions on the horizon for us to to return back to the new abnormal, because the situation within our context has never been normal, in inverted commas, because inequality is never normal, or ought not to be normalized. So what does 2021 then entail? I know that there are now current developments suggest that there might be vaccines on the horizon. There's advocacy around people vaccine. We know in terms of access to commodities and resources that marginalized people often get access to those very resources last because of how we experience that marginalization in accessing care and services. So what does 2021 look like for you at this moment?
So basically, in terms of agency in relation to setting the agenda, I think this is something that definitely is key to start organizing the movement around, because the pertaining situation is that those affected then are found in a position of power to be able then to set the agenda on our behalf. But I think the more we start to strategize collectively as movements in relation to then being able to set our own agenda and have clarity into and the specific, especially environmentally as well, in order for the movement to grow, but also to speak to even the most affected of persons. Also, the other important aspect I think would be around owning and creating knowledge, gathering information. And I think one of the initiatives that regionally will be taking place, headed by GDX as a partner, is speaking to that aspect in relation to being able to collect information, and not only collect, but create and publish out there in relation to how we are affected by various situations, but also speaking to our own reality from our context, and not necessarily having external players then taking the lead in terms of putting out knowledge in relation to what is affecting us, which also will curtail the issue of our needs being framed from somewhere else other than from our own context and reality. So I think those are two important aspects that I'm really looking forward to, and just strengthening the ways in which our movement engages strategically, particularly in the South and in the Southern region. So for me, that is something I'm really looking forward to.
Sam, Whitney?
I think for Trans Wellness Project, we want to strengthening our already existing partnerships that are great partnerships currently with organizations like Triangle Project, WITS, GDX, and also being part of the SATF. This is in order for us to advocate against government issues. The thing is, rural and remote areas in South Africa, the trans and gender diverse people's voices are not heard. So not Triangle Project, sorry Sharon. Trans Wellness Project wants to do more research so that our voices can come out, because our voices are missing in policies and in policy making in settings like this. So, and one of the dreams of TWP is that we start giving services that really matters to our people, and the services that currently are of the most highest importance are sexual reproductive health services in the rural and remote areas in South Africa, because currently we're spending too much money for traveling up and down to cities in order for our people to access to these services. In short, that is that, but there is more. There might be more coming up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for sharing your insight, your experience, and your expertise on the subject matter of what it means to live with dignity, what it means to fight for equality, and of course, what it means to embody freedoms within this region that we find ourselves in. I think that there are a couple of key messages that have come through in terms of questions around how we choose to organize, issues concerning service delivery, the decentralization thereof, the issue that the current challenges that we are experiencing have only been proliferated by COVID-19, but even if COVID-19 is addressed, we are still going to be left with them moving forward, and there's a lot of work that still needs to go into that. So thank you so much for that. From our end, just want to thank everybody who has come out to join us for this conversation. Apologies for you not being able to participate via visual and audio features. And from our end also, all of the best with the rest of Out Summit, and we are hoping to tune in. Thank you, Nish, for the technical support in the background, and take care, everyone.